Just over 60 years ago, our world teetered on the precipice of annihilation as the deadliest showdown in human history played out over 13 terrifying days. Humanity was almost pushed into the abyss 3 times. A lost US pilot, a frantic Soviet officer, and a terrified submarine commander all nearly claimed the horrifying title of the man who destroyed the world. Today, we delve into the terrifying secrets of the Cuban Missile Crisis, unveil the hair-raising details of how we narrowly escaped the jaws of nuclear Armageddon, and uncover the roles of those who brought us back from the brink. Throw a hedgehog at Uncle Sam's pants. Many accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis focus on those fateful 13 days, but we're going to go back a little further to where it all began. In the early 1960s, tensions between the US and Cuba were red hot. The US desperately wanted the Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro out of power, and under President Eisenhower, they spent 1960 attempting to covertly undermine him with a series of bizarre schemes. Botched plans included spraying his broadcasting studio with LSD before his speeches, lacing cigars with a chemical that causes disorientation, and even lining his shoes with thallium salts that would cause his beard to fall out. They didn't want to confront him directly, as they were concerned that their overt involvement could trigger an anti-US movement, and if they removed Castro by force, he could be replaced with someone worse. Shockingly though, overthrowing Castro by attacking his facial hair failed, and it became clear that if they wanted him out, it'd have to be done by force. However, sending in thousands of US troops was too blatant, so they attempted a creative solution instead. In place of American troops, the plan was to recruit, train, and support thousands of anti-Castro exiles. Then, when they had a big enough army briefed on the basics of guerrilla warfare, they'd send in American bombers crudely painted as Cuban planes to take out most of Castro's air force, then launch the exile invasion through the Bay of Pigs. John F. Kennedy was US president by the time the plan came to fruition, but things didn't go the way he'd hoped. The mission was botched by the use of inadequate bombers. Over 100 Cuban exiles were killed, and more than 1,000 were taken prisoner. He was humiliated by the defeat, and worse, the volatile Castro was now furious and still very much in power. Castro knew that although he'd won the battle, it would only be a matter of time until the next attack, and that he'd be woefully outgunned if the US came at him with everything they had. Things might have seemed hopeless, but there was another player involved, and they were ready to make their move. At that time, the US and the Soviet Union were locked in the middle of the Cold War, and the then premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had realized that Cuba had a key part to play. The island was important for 2 reasons. Firstly, he strongly believed that the success of the Soviet Union was inextricably linked to the Castro government. If we lost Cuba, he said, our prestige in Latin American countries would diminish, and how would everybody look at us afterwards? Secondly, in early 1961, Kennedy oversaw the installation of the Jupiter intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy. This was part of the largest peacetime expansion of America's military force and gave him the ability to strike both Moscow and Leningrad. Additionally, they were above ground, immobile, and extremely vulnerable. In the event of nuclear war, the Soviets could easily wipe them out, meaning these weapons were only useful for a first strike. Essentially, the US had planted nukes on the Soviet Union's doorstep and said, "These aren't to stop you from nuking us. We put them here in case we want to nuke you first." To Khrushchev, the only rational response was to plant nukes on America's doorstep and see how they liked it. "Why not throw a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants?" he quipped. So in May 1962, he began to form a plan to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. Operation Anadyr. Convincing Castro to let them install the missiles was easy. After all, he'd become obsessed with strengthening Cuba against US aggression, and what could be a bigger deterrent than nuclear missiles? So he accepted the offer with open arms, and Operation Anadyr was born. Khrushchev's plan was to install the missiles secretly, and when fully operational, reveal them to the US as a fait accompli. In his mind, Kennedy would respond the same way the Soviets had done to the missiles in Turkey, annoyed but unwilling to come to blows over. After all, he was only redressing the balance of power. So using the Russian military deception tactic known as Maskirovka and a cover story of agricultural aid, Khrushchev sent short, medium, and intermediate-range nuclear missiles, launchers, anti-aircraft batteries, and around 40,000 troops, providing almost total strike coverage of the U.S. Hiding shipments was relatively straightforward, but Khrushchev faced one problem. Thanks to heightened tensions, the U.S. was conducting regular U-2 surveillance flights over Cuba. This meant that as soon as construction began on the missile sites, they'd be spotted and his cover would be blown. It seemed like an unsolvable problem, but then, remarkably, the U.S. fixed it for him. At the end of August, a U-2 overflight spotted a surface-to-air missile newly installed in Cuba. Then, a week later, they identified a few more. This should have been a clear sign that the Soviet Union was building protection for their soon-to-be installed nuclear arsenal. But to the Americans at the time, they assumed the Soviets were simply strengthening their Cuban allies' defenses. So rather than risk an incident or losing one of their U-2s, the U.S. self-imposed a ban on flights over central Cuba starting September 10th. This created a photo gap where they had no visuals of large portions of the island for over a month, the exact month when the missile launchers were being installed. Finally, in early October, a few overflights were given approval, and on October 14th, Major Richard Heiser set out for a 6-minute journey over an area of Cuba that they hadn't set eyes on in 45 days. During that short mission, he took 928 photographs, which revealed the worst. A Soviet nuclear missile site under construction just 90 miles off the coast of America. This information plunged Kennedy into the 13 tensest days in the history of humankind.
That a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation.
Unlike his Soviet counterpart, he couldn't accept the missile placement lying down. Not because they represented a significant change in the nuclear balance, because they didn't, but because Kennedy had made his tough attitude toward Cuba a key part of his campaign. He'd been humiliated in the Bay of Pigs, and just 1 month earlier, he told the American people that he wouldn't permit Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles threatened not only his reputation, but also his administration and the standing of the U.S. in the eyes of its allies. The threat wasn't necessarily nuclear, it was psychological, but just as dangerous. In response, Kennedy assembled a team of his closest 12 advisors and dubbed them the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. These 13 men met day and night to propose and evaluate every possible course of action. Solutions ranged from doing nothing through negotiating to a full-on airstrike of the missile sites. The hope had been to evaluate each option's strengths and weaknesses logically, but soon the group had divided into two camps, now known as the Hawks and Doves. Horrifyingly, the Hawks were pushing for the surprise airstrike supported by the garrison they had in Guantanamo. Military force, they said, was the only way to get through to the Soviets. What they didn't know, however, was that they were working off false intelligence. They believed that there were only 10,000 Soviet troops in Cuba when there were in fact 40,000. And they had no idea that the Soviets had a short-range nuclear weapon capable of taking out the Guantanamo garrison before they could fire a single shot. Triggering the use of this nuke would mean the U.S. would have to do the same, and mutually assured destruction was the most likely outcome. The Doves, on the other hand, argued for a more restrained approach and proposed a blockade to prevent any more weapons from entering Cuba. But this came with its own problem. While outrageous, the Soviets' actions were technically legal, and a blockade was not. Therefore, imposing one could be considered an illegal act of piracy or war. Kennedy was being pulled in both directions. Even his own brother Robert was strongly in favor of an attack, to the point that historians believe that had he been in charge that day, we'd have seen a full-scale invasion and the end of life as we know it. But John Kennedy was more restrained, and against the Joint Chiefs of Staff and congressional leaders, he ultimately decided that the more peaceful blockade was the place to start. To solve the active war issue, they rebranded the blockade to a quarantine, stating they'd only intercept weapons. All that was left to do was announce it in a way that showed just enough strength to reassure the American people, but not enough to enrage Khrushchev and start a war. So on October 22nd, Kennedy delivered an address that went down in history. In it, he announced that they had unmistakable evidence of offensive missile sites on Cuba capable of striking Washington, D.C. and most major cities in the Western Hemisphere. This, he said, was an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas. He pressed the point that any nuclear missile launched by the Soviet Union would meet a full retaliatory response, but that he knew the fruits of victory would be ashes. More than one man would later personally thank the scriptwriter for making that speech so scary it successfully convinced their girlfriends that October 22nd would be their last night on Earth. Are you wondering how you can support our channel? Simply like, share, subscribe, and we'll keep illuminating the most incredible shadows of history. Black Saturday. To enforce the blockade, the U.S. Navy deployed almost 200 vessels 500 miles north of Havana, and on October 24th, the first round of Soviet vessels was spotted heading their way. This would be a pivotal moment. If they attempted to cross the blockade, the Navy would have to stop them, and any military confrontation had the potential to escalate into war. XCOM held their breath. Then, remarkably, the ships turned back. It was working. Khrushchev had chosen not to escalate, and there was hope for resolution. Behind the scenes, the two leaders exchanged long, rambling, intense letters. Kennedy repeatedly insisted on the removal of the missiles, and Khrushchev kept replying that they were purely defensive, just like those in Turkey. Things started getting heated as Khrushchev accused Kennedy of not listening to reason, attempting to intimidate the Soviet Union, and committing piracy with his blockade. It looked like war was back on the table, but then Castro got involved. His paranoia about a U.S. attack had grown to the point where he was convinced that they'd attack sometime in the next 48 hours. So he wrote a letter to Khrushchev, pleading that they must never allow the U.S. to carry out the first nuclear strike. In other words, he was urging Khrushchev to launch the nukes first. This, however, was the wrong way to play the firmly anti-war Khrushchev. Fearing the volatility of his Cuban ally, his next letter to Kennedy showed a marked change in his tone. It was a heartfelt and quite poetic essay in which he spoke of the abyss that stood before them. He wrote that by imposing an illegal blockade, Kennedy had tied a knot of war, and that if both countries were to pull it, it would be so tight they'd have to cut it, and that, he said, would doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war. So instead, he suggested they relax their forces and untie the knot. Or, more specifically, if the U.S. lifted the blockade and promised not to invade Cuba, he'd remove the missiles. It was a breakthrough. They both wanted peace, and the terms seemed agreeable. So Kennedy drafted a telegram to accept. Unfortunately, though, the very next day, everything went suddenly and catastrophically wrong, and October 27th would become known as Black Saturday. The first near disaster came when a U-2 air sampling mission of the Arctic took place. In retrospect, it should have been canceled, but everyone's attention was focused elsewhere, so the pilot had forged on regardless. Unfortunately, he found himself blinded by the northern lights, and instead of returning home, he accidentally spent hours flying in Soviet territory. Washington sent F-102 interceptor jets to escort him out, but they didn't realize that as they were on DEFCON 2 alert, these had been armed with nuclear missiles. If the Soviets interpreted their presence as an attack, it could trigger war. Everyone held their breath as the lost plane was escorted out over Siberia. You could hear a pin drop until Kennedy broke the tension with, "There's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the message." Little did they know that while their attention was focused on Siberia, something far worse was happening in Cuba. Throughout the crisis, the U.S. kept a close eye on the island by continuing their unarmed reconnaissance flights. To them, it was a logical necessity to monitor the progress of the launcher construction, but to the Soviets on the ground, it was psychological warfare. Every time they heard the roar of planes above them, they assumed it was the airstrike that would kill them. No one had any sleep, and everyone was close to a nervous breakdown. One of those feeling the pressure was Soviet Lieutenant General Stepan Grechko. He'd been watching a U-2 on the radar for over an hour, and with each second, grown more anxious. Surely the plane was there to map their positions in preparation for a strike. Grechko wanted to shoot it down, but didn't have the authority, and his commanding general was nowhere to be found. Eventually, though, the pressure got too much, and he gave the order regardless. Destroy target number 33. 2 surface-to-air missiles launched on his command, and one tragically exploded next to the U-2 cockpit. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, was killed instantly as shards of shrapnel sliced through his flight suit and helmet. Within hours, an aide was racing to Kennedy with the news. They fired the first shot. At this moment, it seemed like Kennedy had no choice. The hawks from XCOM were insisting the shooting was at Khrushchev's order, and reminded him that he'd pledged to destroy any missile launcher that shot down a U-2. But if he did that, escalation seemed inevitable. Plus, he was sure Khrushchev wouldn't have abandoned diplomacy yet. He had to trust that the shooting down the U-2 had been a mistake, but what if he was wrong? He knew the fate of the world now rested on his decision. What he didn't know, though, and what wouldn't be revealed for another 40 years, was that this decision was very nearly taken out of his hands. At 5 p.m. that same day, the U.S. destroyers, tracking 4 Soviet submarines near the blockade, decided it was time for them to surface. To signal them, the protocol was to drop practice depth charges, which would make a loud bang underwater. However, the crew resented this soft option and also dropped hand grenades stuffed into toilet roll tubes. The tubes would disintegrate as they sank and hopefully explode next to the submarine's hull. One of the Soviet officers inside later described this as being inside an oil drum hit with a sledgehammer. Eventually, the Soviet sub complied with the signals and surfaced. Above the water, they found themselves surrounded by U.S. destroyers and anti-submarine aircraft, which, according to submarine captain second class Vasily Arkhipov, were swooping just 20 to 30 meters above them. To add to the chaos, the Soviet crew was also blinded by powerful searchlights, and over 300 shells were fired in their direction. Faced with a sensory onslaught, the sub's commander panicked. Having had no way to communicate with the senior officials back home, his natural assumption was that war had broken out and they were about to be killed. His first instinct was to call for an emergency dive and attack. In ordinary circumstances, this would have been enough. But what the U.S. didn't know was the sub was armed with a nuclear missile that, provided the 3 senior officers on board agreed, they could launch without permission from higher-ups, and that's exactly what the commander and political officer wanted to do. Only Arkhipov had any doubts. Miraculously, as the commander rushed to give the signal to dive, he was held up in the narrow staircase. This gave Arkhipov just enough time to realize that the shells coming at them were missing on purpose. The U.S. weren't attacking, they were signaling. So he vetoed the order to launch the nuke and went down in history as the man who saved the world, untying the knot of war. Black Saturday was undoubtedly the most stressful day of the crisis for both sides. Each leader could feel the situation slipping out of control, and both had seen how close we'd come to nuclear war. They both wanted it to end. The only problem was that Kennedy had now received another letter from Khrushchev, this time one with an additional stipulation. He still wanted to end the blockade and assurance the U.S. wouldn't attack Cuba, but now he demanded the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This was a problem for 2 reasons. Firstly, the Jupiter missiles were a result of a special decision by NATO. If Kennedy removed them on Russia's demand, it would undermine the entire structure of NATO and irreparably damage his political career. Secondly, the request was ridiculously reasonable. There was no arguing with it. If missiles in Cuba were comparable to missiles in Turkey, as Kennedy himself had admitted, it was only fair that they both remove them. Apart from anything else, the Jupiter missiles were already obsolete, and Kennedy wanted them gone anyway. But how could he meet Khrushchev's quid pro quo without damaging NATO? Once again, they had to get creative. But as we know, that hadn't gone well before. The plan was to publicly ignore Khrushchev's second message, which mentioned the Jupiter missiles, and instead agree to the terms of the first letter. Then, under the cover of darkness, Kennedy sent his brother Robert to a secret meeting with the Soviet ambassador. In their discussion, Robert explained the NATO issue, but said there was a way around it. Kennedy was willing to agree to remove the missiles, but not as part of the Cuban crisis agreement. Instead, he'd do so in 4 to 5 months and pretend it was completely unrelated. The one condition was that this side agreement remained completely secret, as only 2 to 3 people in Washington knew about it. Of course, the ambassador lacked the authority to end the crisis, so what followed was a sleepless night waiting to hear Khrushchev's answer. Would he agree to have his terms met if it meant publicly appearing as if he'd been the one to compromise? Then came a broadcast through Radio Moscow. The Soviet government, they announced, has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating in return to the Soviet Union. It was over. Kennedy's team took the opportunity to spread the news that he had effectively won the negotiations without compromising anything, and his Secretary of State announced, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. However, the truth was, both sides blinked, as both gave up their missiles. But that wouldn't be revealed until classified documents on both sides were released 20 years later. By November 20th, the U.S. was satisfied that all the nuclear weapons had been removed, and they lifted the blockade. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Over 60 years later, it'd be nice to say that the threat of nuclear warfare is behind us. But today, the doomsday clock stands at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, it didn't move, remaining at 7 minutes to midnight. Of course, the truth of just how close we came in that submarine wasn't revealed until decades later. What do you think? Are we closer now than we were then? Did we learn anything in those precarious 13 days? Thank you for watching Shadows of History. If you think we managed to capture the tension and terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis, like, share, and subscribe. Your support will help us keep making videos and revealing history's best-kept secrets.